Hey, welcome to Agnes Thompson's channel. My name's Eleanor Vance, and I'm going to share my story with you.
The persistent perfume of dried lavender and aged paper was my constant companion, a comforting scent that clung to the heavy velvet drapes, permeated the stacks of well-loved books, and settled like an invisible dust on the ornate, hand-carved furniture of my Victorian home. At 68, in the quiet, tree-lined suburbs of Westchester, Pennsylvania, I knew this house wasn't just a dwelling, it was a living chronicle, a sanctuary where every object whispered a story, every stack of papers held a memory, every overflowing drawer a piece of a life meticulously lived. My children, Sarah and Michael, and certainly my grandchildren, often called it cluttered. I preferred a repository of memories, though I rarely bothered to articulate that sentiment aloud. It was simply easier to let them think what they wanted. After all, what could they truly understand about the accumulated weight of a lifetime, the intricate narratives woven into every seemingly insignificant object? My mornings began precisely at 6:30 a.m. First light, a pale, hesitant wash, filtered through the antique lace curtains, illuminating the dust motes dancing in the air, tiny, ephemeral galaxies. I'd rise, my knees giving a familiar, dull protest that had become a constant companion since Arthur's passing, and make my way to the kitchen. The old percolator, a wedding gift from Arthur's aunt, would already be gurgling, filling the room with the rich, earthy aroma of brewing Earl Grey. I'd sip it slowly, savoring each drop, by the bay window overlooking my sprawling, slightly untamed garden. This garden, a riot of heirloom roses and wild herbs, was another quiet rebellion against modern sensibilities. Sarah, with her Pinterest-perfect aesthetic, envisioned neat rows of hydrangeas. I saw a living tapestry, each plant a testament to patience and enduring beauty. The buzzing of bees and the flitting of hummingbirds were my morning news, far more enriching than anything on a screen. Life since Arthur's passing a decade ago had settled into this quiet rhythm. Our children, Sarah, a sharp marketing executive in Philadelphia, and Michael, a brilliant but aloof software engineer in Pittsburgh, lived bustling lives. Their visits were less frequent, punctuated by hurried calls filled with updates about careers, children's extracurriculars, and polite inquiries about my well-being. They were good kids, driven and well-meaning, just busy. Their world moved at a relentless pace, fueled by digital screens and fleeting trends. My world, by contrast, was built on tangibles, the solid weight of a well-loved book, the comforting texture of a hand-stitched quilt, the undeniable presence of history in every nook and cranny of my home. This house, this magnificent, slightly creaky Victorian, was indeed cluttered by modern standards. But it wasn't the chaotic detritus of a reality TV hoarder. Instead, it was a meticulously, albeit organically, curated collection. Boxes of letters from Arthur's time in the Korean War, meticulously preserved newspaper clippings detailing local history, my grandmother's collection of vintage fabric scraps occupying an entire cedar chest. My sunroom workbench, covered with half-finished quilting projects, was a testament to a life spent creating and making do. My hands, though often aching with arthritis, still found profound comfort in the tactile world. I wasn't a Luddite entirely. I had a smartphone and an email account, but I preferred the tangible, the physical connection to information. I found peculiar comfort in the weight of a newspaper, the rustle of a letter, the deliberate turning of a page. Or so I thought. One blustery Tuesday morning, the quiet hum of my home was abruptly, jarringly shattered by the insistent, shrill ringing of my landline, a quaint anachronism, but utterly dependable. I picked it up, expecting Mrs. Henderson from next door, perhaps asking for a cup of sugar or to gossip about the unusually cold spring. Instead, it was Sarah. Her voice, usually so composed, was frayed, thin, almost breathless. "Mom, you need to hear this. It's about Dad's pension." My heart, usually so placid, gave a sharp, alarming lurch. A cold, metallic taste filled my mouth. Arthur had worked tirelessly for nearly 40 years at Mid-Atlantic Steel, a pillar of the community before its painful closure a decade ago. His pension, the bedrock of my financial security, was managed by Summit Financial. They'd always seemed reputable, their quarterly statements arriving like clockwork, reassuring in their predictability, their logo, a stylized mountain peak, conveying unshakable solidity. Sarah's words tumbled out in a torrent, each one a hammer blow to my fragile peace. "Mom, there's been an announcement. It's on all the news channels, trending on Twitter, everywhere. Summit Financial, they've filed for bankruptcy." Chapter 11. "It's bad, Mom. Really bad." Her voice cracked. A cold dread, sharp and insidious, seeped into my bones. "Bankruptcy? What does that mean, dear?" I whispered, though I already suspected the worst. The word hung heavy in the air, a harbinger of ruin. "It means there might be nothing left, Mom," Sarah explained, her voice raw with fear. "For any of the pensioners. Reports say massive mismanagement, maybe outright fraud. Assets frozen. Lawyers say it could take years to untangle, and even then, people might get pennies on the dollar." "Mom, people are talking about losing everything. Their homes, savings, medical care." My mind reeled. Years? Pennies? The phrases echoed hollowly. Arthur's pension wasn't just money, it was his legacy, his years of backbreaking work, his promise. It was the foundation upon which I'd built my quiet life. Without it, my modest savings, meant for emergencies and rising Medicare costs, would dwindle rapidly. This house, my sanctuary, would become an unbearable burden. But what about the guarantees? The insurance? I stammered, clinging to any hope. Sarah sighed, a weary, defeated sound. "Mom, it's complicated. The way they structured things, it's a mess. Lawyers are calling it a classic shell game, moving assets, hiding funds in complex offshore accounts. It's bad, Mom. Really bad. Worse than anyone initially thought." A profound weariness settled over me. This wasn't just financial. It was a deep, personal betrayal. Of trust, of Arthur's decades of labor, of their planned future. My children, bless their hearts, were immediately concerned. Michael, ever the pragmatist, talked of legal options, class action lawsuits. Sarah, the more emotional one, offered to help me downsize. "Mom, honestly, this house is just too much for you anyway," Sarah said gently, her voice tinged with familiar exasperation. "Think of the upkeep, the taxes, the utility bills. With this news, it's probably for the best. A nice condo, something easier. Less stuff." Her words, though well-intentioned, felt like a swift kick to the gut. Downsize? Abandon my home, my sanctuary, my life's accumulated treasures? It felt like capitulation. They saw my possessions as a burden. I saw them as anchors, tethering me to a past that held so much meaning, a past now under siege. Over the next few days, the news grew grimmer. Local channels aired heartbreaking stories of elderly pensioners, their retirement dreams shattered. Faces I recognized from the grocery store now looked out from TV screens, hollowed by despair. The scale of the deception was horrifying. Summit Financial had preyed on the very people who had built this nation, those who had worked tirelessly, trusting in the system. I felt a surge of something I hadn't felt in a long time, not just fear, but a quiet, potent anger. Not the impulsive anger of youth, but a deep, resonant fury, born of years of quiet observation and a profound sense of justice. They thought I was an old woman, easily dismissed, easily moved aside. They thought my clutter was a weakness. They didn't understand that sometimes, what appears to be excess is actually preparedness. What they saw as old-fashioned, I knew was resilient. I watched Sarah and Michael fret, discussing abstract legal terms, financial advisors, court proceedings that would drag on for years. They meant well, but their solutions felt abstract, out of my control. I felt a familiar pang of being dismissed, my practical wisdom overlooked. When I tentatively suggested looking through Arthur's old papers, they exchanged a quick glance. "Mom, what could possibly be in there that hundreds of lawyers haven't already seen?" Michael asked, a note of gentle condescension in his voice. "Everything's digital now." A wave of doubt, cold and sharp, washed over me. Maybe he's right, I thought, the words a bitter echo in my mind. Maybe I am just an old woman, clinging to things that no longer matter. Maybe this is just the way the world works now, too fast, too complex for someone like me. The thought brought a dull ache to my chest, heavier than the arthritic pain in my hands. To be powerless, to be dismissed, it was a fate I had always fiercely resisted. But the scale of this problem felt immense, insurmountable. I closed my eyes, picturing Arthur's steady, determined face. He never gave up. He believed in documentation, in leaving a clear paper trail. Eleanor, he'd always said, paper never lies. And in this house, this labyrinthine treasure trove where every drawer held a secret, every box a memory, every creaking floorboard a whisper of the past, I had a hunch. Not a lawyer's hunch, but an old woman's hunch, born of 68 years of living, observing, and intuitively knowing the true value of what others casually discarded. This crisis, while devastating, also ignited something within me. A stubborn refusal to be defeated. A quiet, yet fierce resolve that this old dog, dismissed by her own kin, still had a few tricks left. The hunt, quiet and solitary, began. I wasn't just looking for answers. I was looking for vindication, for Arthur's legacy, and for a way to prove that the old ways still held power. The days that followed Sarah's devastating call were a relentless blur of anxious phone calls and unsettling news reports. Each broadcast about Summit Financial deepened the cold, hard pit in my stomach. The faces on the television were heartbreakingly familiar, people I knew from the grocery store, from church, from neighborhood potlucks, their eyes hollowed by despair. My children, particularly Michael, urged me, with increasing insistence, to officially join the class action lawsuit. "It's the only way, Mom," he'd insisted, his voice tight with worry. "You can't fight this alone." I listened patiently, nodding, offering non-committal hums. I even let Sarah email me the link to the law firm's online registration form, which I promptly saved to a folder I rarely opened. But inside, a profoundly different plan was already taking root, blossoming from that initial seed of an idea Arthur had planted decades ago. Arthur kept everything. It wasn't just a habit, it was a deeply ingrained philosophy, a fundamental belief in the enduring power of verifiable truth. He believed in documentation, in leaving an undeniable paper trail. Eleanor, he'd always said, paper never lies. My children, bless their digital native hearts, saw paper as an impediment, an archaic burden. They offered, with well-meaning condescension, to help me sort through things, which I knew was code for get rid of everything you don't use every day. I politely declined, citing my own need for quiet reflection, for a methodical approach. They, predictably, interpreted this as my usual stubbornness. "Oh, Mom," Sarah would sigh, "always with your projects, your little mysteries." Little did they know, my reflection involved a deep, painstaking dive into the labyrinth of my own home, a meticulous treasure hunt for a truth I felt instinctively was hidden somewhere within its very walls. My first stop was Arthur's old study. It still held the faint, comforting scent of old books, pipe tobacco, and the metallic tang of his well-oiled drafting tools. Every shelf was packed, every drawer filled. I started with his heavy, olive green metal file cabinets, running my fingers over the faded, hand-labeled tabs, household bills, taxes, by year, medical records, investments. The investments drawer, of course, was my immediate target. Inside, neatly tabbed and secured with old, rusty paper clips, were years of quarterly and annual statements from Summit Financial. The sheer volume of paper was daunting, but also oddly comforting, a physical manifestation of Arthur's foresight. I spread them carefully across his large, mahogany oak desk, the dust motes dancing in the thin strips of sunlight filtering through the Venetian blinds. On the surface, they all looked reassuringly similar: quarterly summaries, impressive growth percentages, consistently reassuring totals. The language was blandly professional, designed to inspire confidence. But Arthur had a system. He'd make little notes, small calculations in the margins, comparing figures, cross-referencing. My eyes, though sometimes blurring despite my bifocals, still possessed a meticulousness honed by decades of detailed quilting. I knew how to find the flawed stitch in a seemingly perfect seam. As I painstakingly sifted through the statements, quarter by quarter, Year by year, a subtle, almost imperceptible pattern began to emerge. Tiny discrepancies. Not huge sums, but small, nagging inconsistencies. 0.25% here, a few dollars there, always slightly off from what he'd calculated. Arthur had always been a stickler for detail, an engineer by trade, with a mind built for precision and an inherent distrust of anything too smooth. He'd often grumbled to me about fuzzy math or sloppy accounting. Now, those seemingly insignificant grumbles resonated with a chilling, undeniable clarity. They weren't quirks, they were warnings. He hadn't just accepted the statements as gospel, he'd audited them. And in the margins, in his neat, spidery handwriting, he'd meticulously documented his findings. Small, almost imperceptible differences between what was reported and what he believed should have been the true value. He'd circled dates, added pointed question marks next to suspicious entries, even drawn tiny, frustrated frowns. These weren't large sums in isolation, a few dollars here, maybe 20 or 50 there. But cumulatively, over years, across thousands of accounts, the thought sent a cold shiver down my spine. It spoke not of error, but of intent. 1,000 tiny cuts could bleed a man dry. My next stop led me to the attic. It was a place my children generally avoided, calling it Mom's final frontier of stuff. For me, it was a living chronicle. Boxes of old tax returns, meticulously labeled by year, stacked neatly against the sturdy wooden beams. Arthur had always kept copies of everything, a habit born from a deep-seated distrust of large institutions. "Eleanor," he'd said, "if it's important, you need your own proof." I found the boxes, thick with the nostalgic smell of old paper and dried cedar. My lungs sometimes protested the dust. I painstakingly pulled out every tax return from the last 15 years, looking for any mentions of his pension, any supplementary forms related to Summit Financial. There, tucked carefully into the 2010 return, was a small, square, handwritten note from Arthur, folded twice inside a paper-clipped W-2 form. It read, "Called Summit about discrepancy in Q3 statement. Rep. Mr. Sterling said clerical error. Not satisfied. Keeping records. File under Summit Concerns." The ink had faded slightly, but his precise hand was unmistakable. Mr. Sterling. The name felt like a distant, unsettling chime. He was one of the early representatives at Summit, back when it was a smaller, local firm. This note was a breadcrumb, tangible evidence that Arthur had been questioning things years ago. It suggested a pattern, not just a random error. It hinted at a cover-up. The next few weeks became a solitary, methodical quest, fueled by copious amounts of Earl Grey and a growing, almost feverish, sense of purpose. My children called frequently, asking if I'd signed up for the lawsuit. I always demurred, saying I was just sorting things out, which satisfied their desire to feel helpful. They saw the volume of my possessions as an obstacle. I saw it as a vast, untapped library of information. I found old appointment books from Arthur's desk, small, leather-bound volumes filled with his precise notations. He'd noted every phone call, every meeting. One entry, from late 2011, stood out, "Meeting with Sterling, concerns about portfolio performance." Still vague answers. Promises to look into it, no follow-up. Another from early 2012, "Sterling left Summit. New rep, Ms. Davies. Reviewed accounts with her. Still minor discrepancies, but hard to pin down. She seems new, unhelpful." This was a key development. Sterling's sudden departure and the continuation of these minor discrepancies. It suggested a systemic issue, not just one bad apple. It felt like I was meticulously piecing together a vast, intricate quilt. The pattern of deception was slowly, inexorably, revealing itself. My hands ached from sifting through countless old boxes. My back protested from bending over for hours. My eyes strained in the dim light of the attic. But with each discovery, a surge of adrenaline, a renewed sense of purpose, washed over me. This wasn't just about my pension anymore. This was about Arthur, about honoring his quiet diligence, about exposing a deep-seated deceit, about fighting for the many other retirees whose trust had been so cruelly abused. Their faces, etched with worry on the television screen, fueled my resolve. I remembered a casual conversation with Arthur, years ago. He'd been talking about a former colleague, Frank Peterson, a fellow engineer and meticulous record keeper, who had also been an early investor with Summit. "Frank's a smart cookie, Eleanor," Arthur had said. "He knows how to sniff out a rat." I wondered if Frank had noticed anything similar. I found Frank's contact information in an old address book, tucked away in a dusty drawer in the kitchen. Frank was listed with an old landline number, still grumbles about newfangled cell phones. I dialed, half expecting a disconnected tone. To my surprise, a gruff, familiar voice answered. "Peterson," he barked. "Frank?" "It's Eleanor Vance, Arthur's wife." A moment of silence, then a sharp intake of breath. "Eleanor. Well, I'll be. Haven't heard from you in ages. How are you holding up with all this Summit nonsense?" His voice was laced with a weary anger. "That's why I'm calling, Frank. I've been going through Arthur's old papers. He made notes about discrepancies in his Summit statements years ago. He even mentioned calling a Mr. Sterling about them." There was another long pause, then a sharp, almost triumphant exhalation. "Sterling, you say? That snake." I knew it. Arthur was always sharper than them. I had my own run-ins with Sterling. He was slick, always had an answer, but the numbers never quite added up. I pulled most of my money out before he left, but I still took a hit. Couldn't prove a thing then. Frank's confirmation was a powerful jolt of validation. It wasn't just my elderly imagination. Arthur had seen something. And Frank, another senior who valued precision, had sensed it too. We were a generation accustomed to details, to looking beyond the glossy surface. I spent hours on the phone with Frank over the next few days. He was a retired accountant, sharp as a tack. We compared notes, piecing together a timeline of Summit's early operations, the subtle shifts in their reporting, the vague explanations. He confirmed that Sterling had been particularly elusive, often citing proprietary algorithms or market fluctuations. The complexity of the financial jargon was daunting, but Frank, with his decades of experience, helped me navigate it. He'd kept some of his old records too, enough to corroborate certain dates and figures. "They thought we were just old fools, Eleanor," Frank growled. "Too trusting, too uneducated." But Arthur was a bulldog. And you, Eleanor, you've got his tenacity. The clutter of my home was proving to be my greatest asset. My meticulously organized boxes of receipts, old utility bills with the smallest notations, even the stacks of outdated phone books, each piece was a potential clue. I had a box of old community newsletters, and within one, a small article about Summit Financial's grand opening in the early 2000s, featuring a beaming photograph of the CEO, Richard Thorne, alongside Mr. Sterling. The irony was bitter. This wasn't just about financial recovery anymore. This was about exposing a monumental lie, about honoring Arthur's memory, about fighting for the many others who had lost everything. My children, still pushing for the class action, couldn't see the individual threads I was pulling. They were focused on the macro, the broad legal battle. I was focused on the micro, the intricate details that would unravel the whole deception. My fingers, stiff with arthritis, moved carefully over the old documents. I used a magnifying glass, a relic from Arthur's coin-collecting days, to scrutinize the fine print. Dates, signatures, company names, every detail mattered. I had always been one to mend what was broken, to piece together fragments into a new, whole cloth. This was no different, just on a grander, more perilous scale. I found another crucial piece, an old prospectus for Summit Financial from its very early days, tucked into a box of Arthur's old college textbooks. It outlined their original investment strategy. But somewhere along the line, their strategy had shifted into riskier, more opaque ventures, without clearly notifying investors. Arthur had underlined a specific clause about material changes requiring investor notification. He'd written a question mark next to it. The pieces were coming together. Not a complete picture yet, but enough to know that Arthur hadn't been imagining things. This wasn't just mismanagement. This felt like a deliberate, long-term pattern of deception. The thought sent a cold shiver down my spine, but also a surge of fierce determination. They underestimated us, the older generation, dismissing our methodical ways, our reliance on the tangible, our ingrained distrust of anything that felt too good to be true. They thought our memories were fading, our attention spans too short for complex financial schemes. But they were wrong. My memory, honed by a lifetime of remembering details, was a formidable weapon. And my clutter was a well-organized arsenal. Even then, when it seemed like everything was lost, when the weight of the paper felt too heavy, a wave of weariness washing over me, I didn't give up. I thought of Arthur, of his unwavering integrity. He would have seen this through, I told myself, straightening my shoulders. The next part of the story will show the true face of everyone involved and the silent, enduring strength found in the most unexpected places. The evidence I had painstakingly gathered, with Frank Peterson's invaluable insights and decades of financial acumen, felt like a powder keg poised to ignite. Arthur's meticulously kept dates, his precise notations, his almost prophetic observations in the margins of old statements, combined with the early prospectus and the marketing materials, all painted a damning picture of calculated deception that stretched back years, far beyond the public's current understanding of Summit Financial's recent, spectacular bankruptcy. This wasn't just a sudden collapse, it was a slow, deliberate bleeding, orchestrated by design, hidden beneath layers of financial jargon. The problem was, how do you present such a mountain of old-fashioned paperwork, of tangible, physical proof, to a world that deals in quick bites and fleeting headlines? And how do you make them truly listen to an old woman, dismissed by my own family as merely an eccentric hoarder? I considered going directly to the high-powered class action lawyers, but Frank and I agreed they would likely be overwhelmed by the sheer volume of paper, the handwritten notes. They dealt in digital discovery, in neatly compiled databases. They wanted broad strokes, not intricate details. No, this required a different approach, one that resonated with my generation's deep-seated understanding of irrefutable proof, undeniable, tangible evidence that could not be dismissed as rumor or speculation. We needed an advocate who understood the power of a human story, not just a spreadsheet. One blustery afternoon, as I was rereading one of Arthur's most heavily annotated statements, a local news reporter, Emily Chin, appeared on my television screen. She was reporting live from outside the now-shuttered Summit Financial offices. Her expression was one of genuine exhaustion as she spoke into the microphone, her voice tinged with empathy as she described the despair of the victims. A thought sparked, bright and clear. Emily had a reputation for thorough, investigative journalism. Perhaps she would understand. I found her email address online, something my grandson, Ethan, had patiently taught me to do. My fingers, usually slow, flew with a newfound urgency. I composed a concise, carefully worded email, explaining that my late husband, Arthur Vance, had meticulously documented discrepancies in his Summit financial statements years ago, and that I believed I had evidence of a much longer pattern of fraudulent activity. I attached a scanned copy of Arthur's note about Mr. Sterling and the 2010 discrepancy, just enough, I hoped, to pique her interest without revealing the entire arsenal. I signed it simply Eleanor Vance, a concerned citizen and retired homemaker. Hours later, as dusk settled, my old landline rang. It was Emily Chin. Her voice was cautious at first, professional, but as I calmly, methodically explained what I had found, the decades of statements, Arthur's notes, the early prospectus, the timeline Frank and I had constructed, her tone shifted. It grew increasingly intrigued, then excited, then finally a note of awe. "Mrs. Vance," she said, my name rolling off her tongue with a newfound respect, "this is fascinating. Absolutely fascinating. This changes everything. Would you be willing to meet? Perhaps tomorrow? My crew and I could come to you. We'd be discreet, I promise." A wave of uncertainty washed over me as I hung up the phone. My heart hammered against my ribs, a frantic bird trapped in a cage. What if this was a mistake? What if Emily, seeing the sheer volume of papers, dismissed it all as the ramblings of an old woman, just like Sarah and Michael sometimes did? The thought made my stomach churn, a knot of fear tightening. The weight of proving Arthur right, of fighting for so many others, felt suddenly immense, almost unbearable. But then, a quiet resolve, born of years of facing life's harsh realities, settled within me. This wasn't just for me. This was for Arthur, for all the others who had lost their security, their dignity. I had to try. I wouldn't let fear make me complacent. Not now, not after all this. The next morning, precisely at 9 a.m., Emily arrived at my doorstep, accompanied by a quiet cameraman and a sound technician. She was impeccably dressed, but her eyes, sharp and intelligent, were wide with curiosity as she took in my house. My children had often looked at my home with polite disapproval, seeing only the density of objects. Emily, however, looked at it with the keen, discerning eye of a detective. She saw the stacks of neatly organized newspapers not as fire hazards, but as historical records, the overflowing bookshelves as reservoirs of knowledge, the antique chests and overflowing cabinets not as clutter, but as potential sources of information. I led her to Arthur's study, a room where the air still seemed to hold the faint, comforting scent of his pipe tobacco. I had meticulously prepared, laying out a selection of the most compelling documents on his large mahogany oak desk, the annotated statements, Arthur's appointment book entries, the early prospectus with his damning underlined clause, and a carefully constructed timeline. I also had a small, fragile envelope filled with original Summit financial marketing materials from the early 2000s, glossy brochures promising unwavering stability. Emily, initially professional, became visibly, palpably engrossed. She didn't dismiss a single item. She handled each faded document with almost reverent respect, her gloved fingers tracing Arthur's precise handwriting, the tiny calculations in the margins, the dates circled in red ink. She asked incisive, intelligent questions, connecting dots that even I hadn't fully considered, seeing the subtle implications of each entry. We spent hours talking, the quiet of my study punctuated only by the soft rustle of aged paper and the occasional click of her camera as she meticulously photographed key documents, her face a mask of concentrated intensity. "Mrs. Vance," she finally said, looking up from a particularly damning stack of old quarterly reports, her voice hushed, filled with a mixture of awe and growing outrage. "This isn't just about mismanagement, as they've claimed. This is a pattern. A long-term, deliberate scheme. This wasn't a mistake, it was a plan, meticulously executed. And your husband, he saw it. Years ago. He had it all documented, piece by painstaking piece. It's incredible." A profound, deeply satisfying sense of vindication washed over me, warm as a summer breeze, easing the tension that had coiled in my chest for weeks. Someone, finally, truly saw it. Someone understood Arthur's quiet diligence. Someone believed me. Emily's report, when it aired a week later on the evening news, sent genuine shockwaves through the community and, indeed, far beyond. It wasn't just a local news story anymore. Major national networks picked it up. She didn't just report on the bankruptcy. She exposed the insidious, long-term fraud, using the meticulously preserved documents I had provided as irrefutable proof. She highlighted Arthur's notes, showing how an ordinary man, a retired engineer, through simple, persistent diligence, had caught the subtle, escalating financial manipulations years before anyone else. She interviewed Frank Peterson, who, gruff but articulate, corroborated my findings, giving them additional, undeniable credibility. The segment ended with a poignant, powerful image of my house, no longer seen by the public as merely a hoarder's nest, but as a silent, living archive of truth, a fortress of forgotten facts. The reaction was immediate and overwhelming. The class action lawyers, who had initially dismissed my inquiries, now called me, their voices eager, even deferential, desperate to incorporate my evidence. The state attorney general's office, under immense public pressure generated by Emily's report, launched a full-scale criminal investigation, citing Emily's segment and the Eleanor Vance collection of evidence as a primary, undeniable catalyst. Richard Thorne, the charismatic but utterly corrupt CEO of Summit Financial, and Mr. Sterling, the elusive former representative who had dismissed Arthur's concerns, were both named prominently in the investigation. Summonses were issued, indictments hinted at. My children, Sarah and Michael, watched Emily's report in stunned, disbelieving silence in their own homes, miles away. When it ended, Sarah was quietly crying. "Mom," she whispered into the phone later that night, her voice thick with emotion, raw with apology. I'm so incredibly sorry. We had no idea. We were so caught up in what was modern and efficient. We dismissed your clutter. We dismissed your intuition. We dismissed Dad's meticulousness. We should have listened to you. We should have paid more attention to Dad's papers, to everything you held on to." The word clutter was conspicuously absent from her vocabulary. Michael, ever pragmatic but now utterly humbled, drove down from Pittsburgh the very next day. "Mom, this is beyond incredible," he said, his voice laced with awe as he stood in Arthur's study, looking at the neatly organized stacks of papers. You literally unearthed the truth. The smoking gun. All this time, we were just pushing for the class action, trusting the system, and you were sitting on the actual evidence that could dismantle their entire operation." He looked around my cluttered living room, his eyes no longer critical, but filled with a new, profound respect. "All this, it's not clutter at all, is it? It's a library. A private museum of the truth. A fortress of proof." It was a quiet, profound reconciliation, far more meaningful than any grand gesture. Their genuine apologies, their newfound understanding, their dawning appreciation for a wisdom they had once dismissed as old-fashioned, that was all I needed. The phone calls from old neighbors and complete strangers, thanking me for bringing the truth to light, for giving them hope, were deeply moving. It wasn't about vengeance, not truly, but about a deep, abiding sense of justice. The legal battle against Summit Financial would still be long, arduous, and complex, but now, armed with irrefutable, meticulously preserved evidence, the victims had a real, tangible chance at recovering at least a significant portion of what they had lost. My unique gift, my meticulous nature, my profound respect for the past, my stubborn refusal to discard what others deemed irrelevant, had not only safeguarded my own precarious financial future, but had illuminated a path to justice for hundreds of others, for an entire community that had been devastated. Life, for me, returned to a new kind of rhythm, a richer, more acknowledged one. My children visited more often, not out of obligation, but with a genuine interest in my stories, in the history held within my walls. Sarah even asked me, sincerely, to teach her how to mend a torn quilt, something she would have scoffed at as too domestic before. Michael, the tech guru, spent days at my house, patiently helping me organize some of Arthur's scanned documents into a searchable digital archive, combining his modern skills with my analog treasures, bridging the generational divide. He even created a robust backup system, something Arthur, with his deep-seated distrust of single points of failure, would have wholeheartedly approved of. The house, once seen as a testament to my charming eccentricities, was now viewed with reverence, almost as a landmark. It wasn't just my home, it was a testament to resilience, to the enduring power of quiet wisdom, to the value of patience and observation. The crisis had stripped away superficialities, revealing the true, invaluable worth of what had always been here, not just the physical objects themselves, but the patient, observant spirit that had safeguarded them, that had seen the patterns invisible to others. And in the quiet of my garden, amidst the blooming heirloom roses, their petals unfurling in the gentle afternoon sun, I sometimes smiled, a small, knowing smile. They thought I was old-fashioned, that my methods were obsolete, that my possessions were merely clutter. They thought their modern world had no need for the wisdom of the past. But in the end, it was that very clutter, patiently gathered and meticulously preserved over a lifetime, that became the unexpected, undeniable key to unlocking a truth that saved not just my family's security, but a community's hope. From a crisis nobody saw coming, a betrayal that had been decades in the making. The wisdom of a lifetime, woven into every thread, every faded photograph, and every piece of paper, proved to be stronger, more enduring, and infinitely more powerful than any modern deception. It wasn't just an act of justice, it was a profound act of love, a testament to the quiet, steadfast power of a life well lived and memories meticulously kept. The clutter had always been the treasure. It just took a crisis and a stubborn old woman for everyone else to finally see it.